Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Morning, everyone. Welcome. And I'm very happy to see a full audience here for the second installment of our two-day lecture series, Capitalism Hits the Fan. For those of you who weren't there last night, we had a great turnout here. Dr. Wolf, who's the first part of the lecture series. I think probably close to 300 people packed in Talbot Hall last night. It was quite the rousing event. So we get to do it all over again here today. And so I just want to say a little bit about how this lecture series came about. I brought a group of economics majors to a conference in Amherst last fall, where Dr. Wolf and Dr. Fraad were both speaking, and they were folks who my students were very eager to go and hear because they'd read things by them in our classes. They're both well known on a national level, and it was very exciting, and they said, could you guys come down here? And Dr. Fraad and Dr. Wolf were delighted to come, and our students in our major and in a number of other student groups worked very hard, tirelessly to raise the money and organize the event. So big thanks to the students. The other thing I want to say briefly is that myself and many others in this room want to thank not just the students who organized the event, but the students who stood up for the university and for the faculty. And what a month it's been. So turning to our speaker, it's a real delight. I've known Dr. Fraad and Dr. Wolf for many, many years. And they together have journeyed through the decades, turning over stones, looking at things that people don't want to look at, looking at things that people don't want to look at in ways that are not necessarily considered to be acceptable or mainstream. But out of it, the energy, the insight, and the power of what they've come up with is nothing short of remarkable. So Dr. Fraad is a mental health counselor and a psychotherapist. She's currently in practice in New York City, and she's practiced for 40 years. But more than that, she was one of the founding members of the second wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, and has a tremendous amount of insight, and that's what's plotted right there. And she has a tremendous amount of insight about where that movement started and where it wound up today. Critical insight, I would say. She has also been a long-time author, and she's done a very interesting thing, which is that as part of a larger association of political economists that included her husband, she became very interested in taking her insights in personal social life and connecting them to a larger economic analysis of society, but also an economic analysis of the household. So as an economics professor, I've always been very happy to expose people to her thinking about what goes on in the household, the nature of labor in the household, and also the nature of class relationships in the household. So out of this, one of her very important works is a book that just got reprinted after a number of years. The most recent version is called Class Struggle in the Household, on the Home Front rather. It was published just a few years back, and if anybody wanted more information on that, they could get in touch with me. She's currently also a journalist who has a bi-weekly radio show in New York City with her daughter called Interpersonal Update. And she also is a journalist writing in a variety of publications, and some of her most recent articles include the kind of provocative subjects like mass killings, why are Americans going postal, in 2013, and Capitalism and Loneliness, why pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So that gives you some sense of, I think, the reasons why you should find her interesting, compelling, and provocative. And so it's a great honor to introduce her to speak about the personal and societal effects of the Great Recession. And she termed the talk, The Great Hurricane Swath Through American Personal Life. With that, Dr. Fraad.
Thank you very much, both for your inspiration for the whole society in standing up to cuts that are outrageous and asserting yourselves, and thank you for the welcome here. What I want to talk about is the effects of the recession on personal life and sexual life in the United States. The backdrop of this is that there has been a steady decline in actual real wages, what you can actually buy in the United States, because for 150 years, from 1820 to the 1970s, each generation of white families did better than the previous generation, and we used to be an overwhelmingly white society. That increase was never available for African American families, but it was available for whites. And starting in the 70s, around the mid-70s, when jobs were outsourced because of profit, not because of anything else, and mechanized and computerized, and millions lost their jobs, personal life has been turned on its head. And it's been turned on its head just as a collateral damage of profit seeking. The whole business was intensified with the current recession, so that a systematic smashing down of the mass of Americans that was going on in any case had a huge boost, as if, you know, the kind of nice blustery wind turned into a hurricane. Well, it wasn't a nice, it was an ill wind that never blew good, but now it's a hurricane. Also, that disaster that happened beginning in 2007 has been a recovery at the top. So it's like a jobless recovery. So that the top 5% have recovered. The stock market is fully recovered. 50% of Americans live at or near the poverty level, always in danger, always insecure about falling into poverty. That's half of us. As Rick mentioned, and I'm sure you know, that's the 47% Romney wanted to throw under the bus as moochers, because people need help. They don't need the oil depletion allowances that people so liberally get, or the $1 trillion to bail out the banks, in which case they wanted the government to intervene to save them. But the mass of us who, having lost jobs and positions, need a hand. The effects of the recession have been the deepest and most cruel for young people. And because a lot of you are young people, I'm going to address myself to those effects. And I'm going to cover 4 areas. Of course, I'm just going to cover the surface, since it's not a life's work here, it's just a talk. One is jobs. Another one is dating, and these are, of course, interrelated. Another one is dating and relationships. Another is marriage and families. And another is sexual relationships. They each have powerful, mutually shaping effects on the others. Now, first, let's look at unemployment. And by the way, if you want the stats that go with that, I brought graphs and stuff. I'm not going to bore you with them now. Long-term unemployment for younger people aged 25 to 34 is 3.5 times greater than it was in 2007, before the recession. There's an estimated 15% youth unemployment rate. College graduates have a better chance than those without college education, but there's been a recession on every level, from not even high school to PhDs. And college graduates are now fighting for their financial, personal, and employment future, which are all connected. For most jobs now, there's a seat over here so you don't have to sit on the floor. For most jobs now, there are required 3 years experience. If you're graduating at 21 or 22, there's no way you're going to have 3 years experience on the job. For those who are wealthy and not in debt, which is a minority, one can have an internship at no pay or low pay, which then will qualify you. So there's again a class discrimination. So that we're taught, if you have no debt and you have money, you could afford that extra 3 years. 10 years ago, in 2004, national student debt was $250 million. Now, in 2014, national student debt is $1 trillion. Big change. Estimates of the time it takes to pay back one's student debt is approximately 20 years, and I am using conservative figures. The salient feature of those jobs that young people can get is precarity, precariousness, insecurity. What Marx and class analytics used to call the proletariat is now called the precariat, because jobs are precarious. Young workers have lost the protection that older workers fought for and sometimes died for. That was the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, time and a half for overtime. Job security is for the moment over until it's reclaimed by the mass of people as the earlier protections were won. My son-in-law is a designer in advertising, and he can be summoned after he's off from work if a client, the bottom line money, wants changes. He can be called back to work either wherever he is on his computer or back to the office to redo the ads to get them ready. If at nighttime the client is dissatisfied, he can be summoned at 6 in the morning to finish the advertising job. And that's common. And because we don't have a powerful socialist presence in this country, or a powerful union movement, or a powerful communist party, or any of the left pushing, we don't have what France has right now, which is a big struggle and legislation that looks like it'll pass, restricting employers from contacting employees more than 11 hours a day. So if you get out at 6 o'clock, they can't call you for 11 hours. Or if you are home, they can't call you for 11 hours, which you think 11 hours, that's a lot. But now that they could call you at all times, that's a protection that Americans need and haven't fought for. I have another client who's in finance. She works from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, except during times when reports are due, and then she's on call all the time and has to work so late at night she can't see her boyfriend, who's her fiancé. She can't see other friends. She is owned by the employer for the month of April, for example, when reports are due. Jobs are precarious across the board. If anyone refuses late hours, overtime, early time, weekends, that person can be fired and replaced, because part of the precarity is every worker is a digit within a computer connection that makes workers interchangeable and therefore dispensable and disposable. Unemployment, of course, helps that. This precarity and shakiness is not only at the job, it's also there in people's personal lives. Relationships are more uncertain than they ever were. The idea of settling down when you can't be sure of making a living, or you can't be sure where you're living, doesn't make much sense. It used to. When America provided opportunities for young people to earn decent wages, it was possible. In 1970, 80% of young Americans 18 to 34 years old were married. Now 28% are married. That's a big difference in settling down. Not that marriage is the greatest thing in the world, but it just does show that people are much less stable than they used to be. There's a clear class divide. The people who are refusing marriage are people who don't have money, who don't have a predictable job, or who don't have a living they can count on, or a location where they know they can settle. There was a deal that used to be in effect. I'm not saying it was a good deal, but it was a traditional gender role deal that for white males, there was a family wage paid, which supported dependent wives and children. What it did was it kind of doomed men to total financial responsibility for other people's lives, and it doomed women to a life of childcare and housework, whether one was fitted to it or not, and service to men based on economic dependency. It was suffocating often and stifling to the people who were involved in it. However, it was a stable life, however unsatisfactory. That's over. There is no stability. And just as an interesting little sideline, in 1965, Patrick Moynihan did a very influential report in which he found that marriage instability was among African Americans was a result of African American pathology. Now that's the case for white working class Americans and white middle class Americans as well, because it turns out, interestingly enough, it wasn't pathology, it was wage discrimination. And that's what's happening now. So what has happened is that couples have divided into basically two groups. And of course, they're humans, there's lots of overlap, there's lots of subtlety. This is clarification for the purpose of analysis, not for the purpose of absolute truth. Relationships are divided between a group that is looking for an equal connection, a connection among equals that share emotions and support, as well as housework and income, which is one kind of relationship, and another of old-fashioned relationships which are unfeasible right now, which consist of men expecting to assuage the assaults on their traditional manhood by having women do the cleaning, the cooking, the housework, the childcare, the emotional connecting, the connecting with relatives and friends, but also working outside the home for income. Those relationships don't last. That's one of the reasons that the red states have a much higher divorce rate than the blue states, because the fundamentalists in the red states push that kind of marriage, which is basically unfeasible, even with the ideological justification for it of male dominance and female subordination, which are written into the Southern Baptist conventions on men and women and are pushed. And so that this is, it's untenable within today's economic and social realities. The only people who are marrying in the first place and then staying married as a large group are people who are college educated and getting better incomes, or who are wealthy. And most of the people who are married and stay married handle their conflicts through, or couples who stay together, handle their conflicts through sharing responsibilities. The wealthy, who are the longest married, handle the conflicts over all the domestic jobs through hiring nannies to take care of their children, maids to do their housework, the assorted level of semi-professional servants like massage therapists, children's party planners, caterers, and so on, to take care of them. And so that they hire poorer women or poorer men and women on service jobs to do the kind of jobs that would otherwise be done by women and cause conflict in today's relationships. In other developed countries, there are many, many less pressures on relationships because they have free quality health care, taking an enormous burden off of couples. They have free quality child care. In France, for example, because I know that best, It's free from age 3 on, and the child cares are these beautiful little houses with master's degree teachers and pediatric nurses on hand and therapy available for troubled families and so on. And it's subsidized care for infants, which costs about $1 an hour, as well as full maternity and paternity leaves and help. So if a woman gives birth in France, she has a coach come to her house to help her get back in shape. She also has someone coming in twice a week by law to do whatever she needs. Laundry, cooking, diaper washing, while she does whatever she wants, taking a walk, seeing a friend, whatever will give her a moment out. And they found that that really reduces child abuse. As a little side note, they did a study of urban parents in the United States and found that 30% hits their infant under 1. So, because it's an easy outlet for the frustration and rage that Americans carry, and they carry disproportionately because we don't have a movement in which we can hopefully connect with other people to make something better and express frustration in a socially constructive way. They have maternity and paternity leaves, in some cases like Norway and Sweden, mandatory paternity leaves, so men can't get extra credit for giving up their paternity leave. It's mandatory. And after-school programs for all children that are subsidized, and subsidized vacation programs, and after-school classes, generous unemployment insurance, and guaranteed paid vacation time for people to spend together, because that's very important on maintaining a relationship, having time to spend enjoying one another. So for example, in France, there are 5 weeks guaranteed paid vacation time that have to be paid by the employer on every job. Makes a big difference. Now back to the United States. Because the economy provides such an uncertain future for the mass of Americans, there's little support for relationships or relationships with children. It's one of the reasons that out of the 30 more developed countries, including some very much less wealthy countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, we have the second to worst in terms of child and family well-being. And relationships have changed from a pattern of looking for a mate and staying in a more or less stable relationship for life, which I'm not saying doesn't feel like a life sentence for a lot of people, but was stable, okay? Please don't take this as an endorsement, to a hookup culture, which then gives way to serial monogamy. So people go through one relationship that lasts a little while, usually about a year, and then another one, and another one, and another one, and perhaps onto a marriage which is 50%, at least 50% likely to end in divorce. 50% of marriages end in separation or divorce, and many, many, many more end without bringing the legal system in it, which is only brought in usually because there's property to fight over. And so that within the priority, which I hold as a human being, that human connection is the most important thing in the whole world, capitalism has isolated people from one another in a very scary way. The fastest increasing kind of household in the United States is people living alone. Half of the people in Manhattan live alone. Now that isn't only an American phenomenon. In Stockholm, 60% of people are living alone. However, there's a difference. In Stockholm, new housing has to have, in many cases, small apartments around a big collective space where people cook collectively, where there's a big kitchen and dining room, where there are game spaces and other possibilities for people to connect. Because they understand that a society's mental health is based on connection. The mass of people can't afford children the way they used to, so the fastest growing kind of couple is couples without children. Where this is really remarkable is that that doesn't matter as much if you are living in most other developed wealthy countries, in all other developed wealthier countries, because there is child support. A good example of that is 71% of single mothers in the United States are in poverty, and 42% of American kids are born outside of a marriage and to a single mother. So that's pretty scary for children. And what happens is that women who expect to and are usually required to work for their whole lives have to plan that they can work for their entire lives, which means that childcare is terribly neglected in our society, which, unlike other wealthy countries, doesn't help people with childcare. An example of that, in Sweden, a single mother earns 98% of what a what a married mother earns or what a man earns. In the United States, even married mothers make 70% of what a man earns, because there's discrimination and no help. So jobs are precarious and shaky. Personal relationships are also precarious and shaky. And these things have been made much worse by the recession, in which corporations have decided for their own profit to leave. And we are all collateral damage. Dating takes place within the shadow of this precarity. And within this precarity, there's another aspect of dislocation, dislocated by the need for profit, and that's sexual relationships. There are a lot of changes that have participated in this changing. The reliability and relatively safe birth control that's available, the right to abortion fought for by the women's movement and gained, even though it's only available in 39 counties in the United States because of the right-wing push against it. But there has that, and the pressure by the women's liberation movement to be able to have equality of pleasure in sex for both men and women, and to have sexuality be available for all human beings. There was a cartoon in the 70s of this sort of heavy, blousy woman with her hair all matted, standing in front of a stack of dirty dishes. And her kid is tugging on her skirt saying, "Mommy, what's an orgasm?" And she says, "I don't know, ask your father," which was, typical of the time. So that these things are changing. An additional change has come from the gay rights movement, which has obviously pushed for sex for pleasure rather than procreation, and been more and more accepted in the United States. These are progressive developments. However, one of the things that's happened as women have gained the right to sexual pleasure and the right to employment without any support in our personal traditional roles of child care and after-school care and support, is that many men, particularly in the religious right, blame women, quote, feminazis in Rush Limbaugh's parlance, or gays, or minorities for their reduced position as dominant. So what they're doing is they don't want to blame the capitalist corporations, who are very powerful, for taking away their dominance and their right to a job, and also their right to some of the other perks A lot of these are men who would have inherited their family's little grocery store that's now taken over by Walmart, or their family's little local hardware store that has become Home Depot, and so on and so forth. And rather than get angry at the capitalists, with great encouragement from the right-wing hate radio sources, they blame women, minorities, gays, and Jews, who they think are the entire capitalist class, even though Jews are 2% of the population. They couldn't possibly pull that off. And but it allows them to pick on relatively powerless groups rather than take on capitalist corporations. These men have 4 hiding places where they can foster their traditional dominant masculinity, often enforced by violence. The US military is the biggest one, $1 trillion a year of expenses, and the only area where America is dominant throughout the world, producing military and invading places. The NRA, which is an overwhelmingly male organization, which has done a spectacular trick of being a lobby for the gun industries, pretending to be a champion of liberty and the Second Amendment. Whoa, that is a good one. And they pulled it off. The religious right, which requires male dominance and female submission in a couple. And the newest and most ubiquitous of all, the porno industry, which is tremendously profitable and is an assault on the emotionality of sexuality, the mutuality of sexuality, the cooperation in sexuality, and is enormously profitable. The search for an ever greater edge, an ever greater share of the market, means a push for ever more bizarre sexual acts, which get to be assumed as normal because that's what people see. Within our Puritan country, we don't have the kind of sex education that they have in other advanced nations in the world. So that kids get educated from watching porno. And what they get educated in is a sexuality that doesn't have anything to do with mutual desire, that shows women being willing if coerced no matter what, that shows sexual acts that are not usually pleasurable to both people, and normalizes things like having somebody come on your face or anal sex, which then people demand in relationships as if that's normal, because they've watched it on TV. They've watched it on porno. Pornography, in terms of heterosexual pornography, homosexual pornography is quite different. It's more like just people having fun having sex with strangers. But heterosexual pornography also involves the humiliation of women, who are always willing no matter what the man wants. As well as, since it's an unregulated area, it's rife with stereotyping. So black women can be portrayed as animals, and Asian women as exceptionally willing to be submissive, and there's no control over that. In addition, it creates pressure on both men and women to sexually fulfill the ideal that is portrayed in porno. So women get embarrassed about, and men feel that women's breasts are inadequate if they're not those high sand breasts that are everywhere in porno. 80% of young women shave and shape their pubic hair or get Brazilian waxes and pull it all out in order to fulfill a porno idea. Whereas 3% of older women do that. And it's not that they did it in their youth either. It's the pressure of pornography on self-image. Men are worried that their penises are too small because they have huge penises in pornography. Testosterone creams are best sellers because men don't feel that they're manly enough. Penis extenders and penis growers are all over the internet because people are made insecure about their own bodies, as well as women having to shave and shape as just another added discipline of femininity. Before a woman goes out on the street, there are these disciplines we need to do that are really because of a profit motive, because of selling deodorant, hairspray, fashion. You're supposed to be thin. You're supposed to shave your legs and your underarms. You're supposed to wear makeup. All those things take a lot of time. That's why women take longer to get out of the house than men. And when you see men and women on a date, you often see women all gussied up, and this guy looks like he just rolled out of bed. Because of the double standard. And that isn't because men actually demand this. That's because of the profitable advertising industry that makes those standards. Porno provides a very comforting refuge for men who are afraid of the new laws of sexuality and mutuality, and also for the new laws of jobs and getting along together. And men are often feeling that they're not real men because they're not dominant in a culture that really doesn't allow it. Pornography has had a huge influence on male sexuality, a much bigger influence than it has on female sexuality. 10% of men at University of Kansas report faking orgasms because they can't have an orgasm without porn. Used to be only women's specialty, faking an orgasm, like in Harry Met Sally. But now men too, because they don't feel secure. Watching pornography excites the same centers of the brain as real sex. And so people trade in one of the most intimate, close connections that they can have with another person for a profitable interaction with a machine that never sees you. That's very lonely. And more people, particularly men, are addicted to porn because they have control of the whole experience. And they don't understand mutuality, and they're afraid of the changed rules. This is very dehumanizing. And what it encourages is a culture of disconnection, even in the most intimate sphere, which is sexual interaction. And not for any ideological reason, but because there's profit to be made. And just as Rick spoke about this, why are we letting them do this to us? This is what capitalism is about, making money over everything. Look what it's doing to us on every level, from the boardroom into the bedroom. Class discrepancies in the United States have led to other young phenomena. The sex trades, the most common experience is the GFE, the girlfriend experience, where one buys a girlfriend for a certain amount of time. It could be for an evening, it could be for a weekend, it could be for a week, where for a certain amount you have a woman's company and sexual availability, and she's there as an emotional confidant and a friend and arm candy in exchange for money. The second most prevalent is something which you can see in most personals seeking an arrangement. That's sugar daddies, where mostly college women and other women up to about 40 years old get their tuition paid and their rent paid to be available to men when they need it for emotional connection, purchased, and therefore the woman can't be exactly making her own terms in this relationship since she's getting a cash, quote, equivalent tuition and an apartment. It's particularly true in cities, in bigger cities like New York, where people come in for business. And a lot, because of student debt, more and more college women and graduate school women are getting into the sugar daddy business. So what are we doing here? Let's look at what capitalism does, not only to our jobs, but to all the interrelated aspects of our personal life, our sexual life, our ability to connect as people, our ability to have relationships, our ability to have jobs we can count on throughout. And this is particularly severe for American men, because women, as the emotional connectors in the traditional couple, it's women who invite the friends over usually, and women who create the dinner, and women have usually looked to other women for emotional support. So as relationships are not sustained, they sustain relationships with their friends, with their families, and with their children. Men don't have those advantages. We had a women's movement that helped us in many ways to get equal rights, although not handling the fact that we're getting equal rights within a system of grotesque and ever-increasing inequality as a system. But we were taught to connect, which is crucial for emotional survival of people. Men counted on women to connect for them, and therefore they're completely lost. That's why the mass shooters are all men, who are going into parking lots, malls, whatever, every other week. If you look up mass killings, every other week there's some mass killing, from the killing of 3 in the parking lot at the Jewish Community Center by that Nazi, to the bigger killings, like the killings at Sandy Hook, where a disgruntled youth killed 26 people, went back to his elementary school. And that's because, I think because men are lost, and the refuges of violent video games that are given to young men, or violent Game Boys, or the military, or porn, don't encourage connection, emotionality, fragility, acknowledgement of our humanness, of our need for each other. And that's what we need to do on every level. And I want to say at the end, because I'm really moved by what you people have done here, you connected with each other to regain your right to an education, to fight the administration who just saw the bottom line and wanted to throw teachers out, and to get those teachers reinstated, and are doing the same for the staff, so that the woman who works in the bookstore, who knows all the books and helps people, can't just disappear one day, as she did, or who's a librarian, or who's a helper of any other kind. That people are joining together to fight for what we all need. And that gives us a connection and a purpose and a mutuality which capitalism is robbing. Thank you. If anybody has comments, questions, reactions, whatever.
Just at the very end, you mentioned how there's a lack of human connection and an appreciation of the fragility that's sort of leading to some of the disconnection that leads to some of the mass shootings and stuff. Well, was there ever a time when men were encouraged to appreciate connection and their own fragility?
No, not that I know of. And I think, but there was a long time when men had women to connect to. And I think still most men, if they're going to be emotional, they'll be emotional with a woman. I remember when my children, who are of course a different generation, they're our children, used to have sleepovers. My daughter and her girlfriends would sleep curled around each other and be happy. If my son had a friend over, he'd have to sleep on the floor, because they were so afraid of the connection and comfort that they could get, that they would be gay or something, that it was a threat to their manhood, and that starting in junior high, which is when most guys start to have severe problems, is when boys stop trusting other boys with their feelings. And that's never been so. It's been one of the terrible things about the traditional male role. And one of the real problems of the women's movement is that we didn't value our strengths and insist on them for everyone. The importance of emotional connection, the importance of caring for people, and what it gives you and what it teaches you. There isn't even now a vocabulary for what you get through emotional labor, what it brings you, what it can give, even though every idea, no matter how abstract, there's a brain scientist called Candace Pert who worked this out, begins with an emotion. And that without emotional connection, humans don't learn to walk or sit up properly. It's required. But it was allocated to women and devalued. And men, instead of teaching men the value of this and developing that value and doing research on that value and what you learn by taking care of life, we wanted to get the stuff men got. Economic power and political power, which we deserve. But we all deserve the whole enchilada. And we didn't really understand that. Yes?
Do you have any comments on serial killers like Ted Bundy who say that like the reason why they go out and feel so disconnected with other people is because of pornography?
In part it is. Ted Bundy's a special case. He was the child of incest of his mother and the grandfather with whom he lived, not a healthy development. And he also was brought up in a bizarre sexual environment, and there's a very, very good set of books on what motivates serial killers, and they're usually acting out in some form what was done to them as children, because children are not protected. Adam Lanza, who killed the 26 people at Sandy Hook, he was an obviously disturbed child. He never got any help. His mother didn't let him out of the house. He stayed in the basement all day watching violent video games right next to his mother's gun collection, and his only recreation was going out with his mother shooting. Hardly healthy, particularly for a child with disturbance. And when he was in school, he was bullied at that school. And he was a strange child who was screaming for help, although an inchoate, unheard screaming. He didn't get it. And, there was a very good talk by, I think, Abby Goldstein, called From His Cradle to Your Grave, about serial killers and what motivates them. And what motivates them is being formed with a level of cruelty that they then act out. There was somebody back there. Was that you? Okay.
Excellent lecture, excellent insights. I've learned a great deal from both your talk and the one last night. However, they seem somewhat reductionist in that they both came back to the root cause is private ownership, capitalism, particularly of large corporations. And I guess my question is, are there any other factors that you can think of, and more importantly, and more to the point, therefore, other than public takeovers of private corporations, are there any other things we can do to help remedy the situation?
Sure there are. I mean, one thing is to start pressuring for housing that takes cognizance of connection. The reason we point to private ownership is that, and also to the lack of a movement, is that those people who fight for connection are overwhelmingly on the left. And those forces that are fostering disconnection in the United States and hatred are largely on the right. So if you're a caller to Rush Limbaugh, and you call in, you say, my wife left me and I'm confused. He says, that's because she's a feminazi, and blah, 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 and they took your job, and so on. Then those are highly subsidized people. And who's subsidizing them? It's like with climate change. I didn't talk about it, but another area of precarity for youth is that the new generations don't know they'll have a planet either. And that's not because of public ownership or public control or public participation. We're talking about democracy in relationships, democracy at work, not just ownership. Look, Russia took over public ownership, but they kept the same relationships. Only bureaucrats replaced private owners, took the profits that people made and decided to distribute them. And surprise, surprise, distributed more to themselves. That there have to be checks and balances between people. That's a great thing about the American Constitution. Even though the right wing pushes that a lot, that it says everything, we have to remember that 6% of the American population could vote after the Constitution. And they had to be white, and they had to be male, and they had to have property. So it wasn't entirely democratic for that 94% of the rest of the people. But there were some good things about it. And one is that all power has to be checked. Only they forgot economic power has to be checked too. Maybe because a lot of them were slave owners, that didn't help, but with the democratic principles across the board. But that really private ownership is part of it, but only part of it. There has to be democracy and interaction on every level and checks and balances everywhere, and not financial dependency unalloyed. I think you were next. I can't remember.
If capitalism was a human being, what do you think it would be diagnosed with?
Bipolar disorder, because of the highs and lows. And that the highs for those who are making it, although they are contaminated too, in an unequal society. Although, let's take drug taking. The worst addiction is at the bottom, where people want to change what their world looks like every day. But addiction is also at the top. I remember I had a high school student as a client who went to a suburban high school that was wealthy, and they were very proud that they could take the drugs their teachers couldn't afford. It gave them an extra incentive. Not only can I get high in your class, but you couldn't afford the high I just bought. So, but across the board, these scourges that were attributed by racists to minorities, and particularly African Americans, like heroin use, the biggest increase is whites. People having children outside of marriage, biggest increase is whites. It's all over there. Young men, many more young men of African American descent are in the prison system, but young men overwhelmingly are in the prison system.
I'm glad to see these kinds of discussions. And I think we all realize there are many, many, many issues that really could use addressing. And I like to focus on the need to recognize cause versus symptom to enable focusing on priorities. And I'm going to focus right now only on the constitutional aspects that were just kind of discussed. And there's a very, very important one that needs to be remembered. In 1789, things were a lot different than they are now.
Yeah.
James Madison kept a day-by-day record of everything they said. It has all the speeches these guys made while they were writing the Constitution. This is not the official journal. It used to be a publicly available book. I think you can still get it. I've had the copy, I've still got my copy, and right now, as far as I'm concerned, it's gold. They did the best they could with what they had available.
Yes.
Not yet. The important point here is the fact of the election. The election is a government function. This is something now my next statement is something most folks have never heard. There are 4 divisions of United States government because the vote is a government function. And yes, it's changed, and all that. Fine, but again, they did the best they could. The important fact is that the vote function has not been maintained
Right.
in the face of the media and
Money.
wealth. That's the important fact. There needs to be a constitutional amendment recognizing the 4th division in light of those concerns.
That's true. And
Thank you.
indeed, there are in Europe measures to have a maximum wage, which I think are sensible. And there should be a check and balance on wealth, which there isn't. FDR tried that,
Suppose we,
and
I'm sorry,
they had the money to take it back.
but suppose as a 4th division, as a recognized 4th division, a very important part of that would expand the communal focus,
It would be a great idea.
allowing intelligent elections, surprise, surprise, and intelligent consumption.
That would be very smart. I mean, even in countries, all capitalist countries are liable to corruption, and every country is liable to corruption. But when I was in France watching TV, I saw, because you're not allowed to have private money in elections in France. You have proportional representation, so if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats in their equivalent of Congress. And we saw 10 candidates each saying what they believed in. They have a few weeks to run. They all present what they stand for on government money for elections. That makes more sense, because then you actually can see what choices you have, and the minority can be represented if you don't have a 2-party system, but many parties and many choices. So there's lots of reforms. Also, there was Tom Paine, who was a revolutionary voice trying to create class equality when the Constitution was being written. This is a long struggle. But I agree with you, there's all sorts of things you can do, yes?
It seems to me that one of the worst things about capitalism is that it privatizes so much of our lives. If you lose your job, it's your personal problem. If you, whatever, all these things are private problems. And until we can socialize and talk about human solidarity, that we have no way of changing a governor, for example, who thinks that the solution to people who've lost their financial ability to support themselves is to just throw them under the bus.
Right.
They're
That's
not going
right.
away.
That's right. Because connection is crucial. And things that disrupt connection have to be changed and stopped. And we have the power. We're the mass of people.
I'm a member of
And then
the
you, sorry.
Portland Food Co-op, and it's been around for 4 or 5 years, and it's slowly getting bigger, and they're hoping to open a storefront in the fall. I would encourage people to check into it online. But I think that's an example of this mutuality, of people cooperating, working together. It's a fairly simple idea, and it's just a narrow aspect of our everyday life, but can you give us some other examples, like a food co-op, that people could become part of? I mean, that would act out this spirit of cooperation and mutuality that I agree is very important.
Well, it's all over. There are co-op babysitting services where people take turns taking care of each other's kids. That's at the most small level. There are every place you see. There's stores. There's businesses. There's publicly owned, which is not the same as co-op power companies. It's everywhere. It's just not touted because it's part of a repressed legacy of cooperation rather than wealth accumulation, which is selfish. I mean, the whole idea. You don't train your kid. Let's go to the sandbox, distract the kids, take all their toys and run. You don't do that. Because you're trying to create a decent human being who shares. And then that's supposed to stop. It's inhumane. It's not nice. You know, capitalism isn't nice. Now, I'm sorry. You go. Next.
I'd like you to comment. I'm sure you're aware of the study the UN did on the cultural levels of satisfaction across the world. And we ended up number 18th, I think. It's commissioned from economists at Columbia. And the leading societies that had the highest levels of personal and as well as economic well-being were all Northern European.
That's right. And they're all very socialistic, whether it's Iceland or Sweden or Denmark or Norway. Norway is a great example because Norway is an oil-rich country. But instead of like a country like Saudi Arabia, where the wealth goes to the top, the wealth is shared across the society. So the whole society prospers. Perfect example of what it can do. Create much better relationships between people. Yes?
Harriet, I know you've written about the crisis of the household. It was kind of underneath a lot of the things that you said today, but you had a very specific article where you talked about the fragmenting of the American household into a variety of different forms, one of which, if I remember correctly, you call the communist household. Yes. And in that, you framed some hope for the future. So I wonder if you could talk briefly about that fragmenting, and then, you know, at the extreme where you call one type of household fascist and another communist. What are you talking about there, and where in there lies some hope?
Okay, well, there's a lot of hope. You know, there's a lot of hope because communal households or communist households or cooperative households or whatever you want to call it are more prevalent than they ever were. People don't collect statistics on that, particularly because they don't have those names. They don't have those analyses. But households where people decide cooperatively how to share their lives, their economic lives, their social lives, their child care, their emotions, are more and more prevalent. You know, that's something that's an ideal for many, many couples. Sometimes it can't be realized because of the work demands, but it is there and present. And it creates a demand for communality, or it can, elsewhere. Now, of course, it's easier to cooperate on that if you have a lot of time together. Sheryl Sandberg, who Gloria Steinem said is the inheritor of feminism, has 9 servants. And so in her book, Lean In, a feminist book, that is one way it's very easy to have lots of time together to work it out. Because the 9, you know, she probably is stuck with the job of managing as a manager, all 9 people. However, that does leave a person with a lot of time and fewer strains than worrying about a kid who's crying, and the daycare, and cleaning the house, and doing the laundry, and doing the shopping, and doing the cooking, and getting to work. Another hopeful thing is that 49% of Americans, young Americans, 30 and under, say that socialism is preferable to capitalism. They are looking for something better. And that socialism also works its way down to relationships. Mutual relationships, mutuality in sexuality, mutuality in sharing, mutuality in emotional connection. And one of the things that indicates that is Rick and I each have an essay in this book, Imagine Living in a Socialist USA. And surprisingly, it's doing very well on Amazon. And it is because people are looking. They're looking. And in terms of households, a household where one person does all the household labor, which they deliver over to another person, and that used to be the woman, who is supported in a household owned by the man. Even when Rick and I got married, the guy, when we got a house, the guy couldn't, the lawyer that we went to was mighty miffed that my name should be on the deed. Of course, that was 48 years ago, but still, that was, seemed bizarre, that kind of sharing. But that wouldn't be bizarre now. Men and women are much more equal partners across the board. On the other extreme, there are independent households where women alone are raising children, or people are living alone. That's the fastest growing form of household in the United States. Or there are what I call fascist feudal households, which are households touted by the religious right, where the woman does all the domestic labor and is sexually available and has to look good too, and also goes out to work. That's the kind of household of the dominant male. He's not supposed to beat you around, but he's supposed to be the in-charge person in the Southern Baptist gender convention, which goes to fundamentalists, and the female is supposed to deliver what the Catholic Church calls the hearth and home, the emotional work for everybody and the domestic work for everybody, and work. And I mean, some people know this expression, but it's the change can be summarized in a popular set of jokes. The old jokes were, from the men's side, men are like linoleum, women say. You lay them right once, you can walk on them for 15 years, right? And the male equivalent was, there's a handy little thing called a wife. You screw it on the bed and it does all the housework, right? And I was telling my daughter about the old prescription to remain virginal, so your unused goods on your wedding day. And she said, you know what I said? It was don't you won't buy the cow if you get the milk for free. In other words, women should stay virginal. And she said, you know what I say, Mom? Why keep a pig in your house if all you want is sausage? Okay? That's a very different attitude. It's a more sexually liberated attitude. It looks for equality. Those jokes, which are very much a tenor of the time, convey that people do have a more communal idea. And they are trying to affect it. It's hard because in America we don't have the supports. Child care, after school care, free health care, help on every level. And that's why we break up and have more single parents than anyone else, more teen pregnancy, although that's also the Puritan repression of sex ed. And we don't have education and connection. In Sweden and in France, in high school, sex ed is about sexual interaction and relationships of equality, and what to do in case a child evolves from that. Of course, the child doesn't have to evolve from that. That's a choice, but it teaches people to choose. And it teaches interaction and connection rather than isolated, profitable porno. Big difference. Yes?
Thank you for being here today. And
Talk loud.
Thank you for being here today and speaking to us. I'm wondering if you have, if you think that there has been a shifting pattern of how the American U.S. society values children, the value that we give to children?
Well, I don't know if it's shifted. I know that starting in the 60s, killing your kid became a crime. Before that, you could take your dead kid to the hospital and say they fell down the stairs. Now you can't. And a lot more has been done to identify child abuse. However, about 7,000 children a year are killed by their parents, overwhelmingly their parents, because kids are still isolated in families, so it's the luck of the draw. If anybody is able to take care of you, just because you're pregnant doesn't mean you could take care of somebody. And there is no oversight. And so there's been progress in awareness. You don't beat your kids in public anymore because people will object. But unlike countries like even England and all over Scandinavia, it's a crime to hit your child. Not that your kids are going to call the police, but if it ever happens in public, or if people show signs of bruising on a child, that's true in France too. There's an investigation, and a social worker is assigned to the family, and it's considered a national emergency, which it isn't here, although there has been progress. As women progress in our rights, usually children progress as well. That's because women have been responsible for children, yes?
As part of your, I'm a physician assistant, and one thing I have noticed when fathers-to-be are able to be in the room when the mother delivers, and they have the opportunity to be there for the delivery, the bonding sometimes that starts right then is hugely helpful. So for young men and women to think about if that is a possibility, then that is one way to start to see the bonding that starts very early. Also here in Portland, I've only lived here 4 years, but there are so many young fathers on the street now carrying their babies and out with them alone, and having those opportunities for mothers and fathers to really spend time with their children in quality ways can really help.
It helps enormously. And it starts with care about having a child, thinking about what is the responsibility for bringing this little life into the world. You can see that clearly in Sweden. If you go into the women's room, it's kind of shocking. It was for me. First of all, the men's rooms all have changing tables because so many more men are involved with their children. But in the women's room, as well as I guess in the men's, they have big life-size posters of happy penises putting on condoms. When you go out, remember me. Having a good time, remember me. With bow ties, with jeans, with, you know, it's something that in our Puritan culture we wouldn't have, but it's an outgrowth of their sex education, which is you educate yourself because you're responsible to another person as well as for your own sexual pleasure, and that you plan before you bring a vulnerable being into the world, even though they have more protections for those vulnerable beings. Wait, I want to give somebody who hasn't had a chance. Okay, yeah?
I have a question, because in Asian country, to hit your children is very normal. I have so many experience by, like, my parents hitting me. But for them, it's a way to teach them what is right, what is wrong. What do you think about it?
I don't think that does it. I think what it teaches kids, they've done studies of this, and it's correlated with aggressive behavior later, with lower grades. And what it does teach is if you're more powerful, you can smack other people around. And it encourages a kind of bullying, which isn't a good idea. It's really unhealthy. And and when people do that, it is unhelpful to their children's development, even though it's a cultural practice. The Christian right really advocates often what I would call torturing your children. If they curse, you put something terribly burning on their tongue. If they masturbate, you put Clorox on their genitals. That, you know, these things are sadistic. And what kids learn is they learn a level of aggression and hatred, which they're likely to take out later on in life. So it's not helpful. Yes?
Yeah. In the southern states, in the Bible Belt, and right up through the west up to Idaho, corporal punishment is still allowed in schools. It's illegal on the West Coast and the Northeast. And
yeah, and it's very harmful. You know, I remember when I was hit by a teacher in 4th grade, I spent the rest of the day just imagining the whole class advancing and smashing her like a tick on the blackboard. I couldn't think of anything else but revenge. Because it was, you know, well, I wasn't used to being hit. But it's an assault on you by a bully. What are you going to do? You're little, they're big. So, you know, it's a terrible thing that we allow. Terrible.
Verbal assaults are also
Terrible.
damaging.
Emotional abuse is terrible. And people shouldn't be allowed to vent on anyone else, particularly on someone utterly dependent on you for survival who can't fight back, and is highly correlated with bullying, which is an enormous problem in the United States. Bullying. Those people who shot up their classmates are overwhelmingly being bullied. And a lot of the men who shoot people up in parking lots and various locations, malls, have been bullied by the society, but they take it out on random individuals. Yes?
Okay. So you talk a lot about how men and individuals across the board have had their instinct for connection suppressed. I think that the left in general has their ability to connect and to forge alliances between sort of causes has been so effectively suppressed that we don't know how to really organize. Like, we're all working to our individual ends down here on the grassroots level, but we don't know how to organize for a grander, cohesive vision for society and to motivate people and get them animated about realizing that. So do you have any recommendations on how we can get that back?
I think that's really important, but I think what's happening, and I kind of hear it as a rumble in the distance, is that all across this country, people are doing what you guys did at University of Southern Maine, what the UPS drivers did in their Wildcat strike, which they won, their Wildcat action, where they weren't allowed to be fired. All over, in the fast food workers in cities across this country, people who were atomized are now coming together. And after a while, a voice for all of these comes together. Occupy was an attempt. It was a naive attempt, because if you sit there in the same place, then it's likely that will happen what did, which is people got their heads beat in a synchronized effort across this country as a decision from the top. But it was an attempt, and it showed us that if you make an attempt to reach people, they come flocking. Just like what you did here. People said no, and they stood up. And what happens is there are lots of little actions which then coalesce to a big movement. And the important thing is not to create a movement that creates the kind of unaccountable hierarchy, which is an oppressive thing, but to be a cooperative entity. Even something as big as Mondragon, that's 105,000 people. They have real accountability. They have a maximum wage for the people who are elected at the top, can't be more than 6.5 times what the average person gets. And people can be repealed, and there's constant, you have to represent people on every level of that society. And of course we could do that, and we could change our workplaces to cooperative workplaces where we decide what to produce, how to produce it, what its effects are on the environment. And in other nations, there's been a lot of that. So for example, in Germany, touted as the most successful economy, in order for, during their recession, any company to get help, I mean, we gave away $1 trillion with no strings attached. For a German company to get help, like GM got, they had to retain all the jobs, they had to have workers on their board of directors, they had to have people in the community who would feel the effects of their work on their board of directors, which isn't the same as a co-op, but it's a movement in that direction of accountability and of no money that the public has earned without having to give back. And that's one of the reasons they have, they have the Linke Party, which influences this, and then the Linke Party influences it back. It's back and forth. So there's a lot we can do, starting from wherever we are, and it will build. I know it. And then there'll come a time, I remember in the 60s, putting up a sign in an African American housing project that we need a meeting, because I was trying to save their daycare center. 50 people showed up. It didn't matter that I was a white lady. It mattered that people wanted a daycare center. And in the women's movement, it went, like wildfire. And the same with the committees to end the war in Vietnam. Once they were there, and we started to have a political party, the American Independent Movement at that time, planners from the city planner's office would come in with copies of plans, how they were planning to take over neighborhoods. People had a place to go and people to go to with whatever concern they had across the board, no matter what it was. And that will happen here. This book has been so successful. Imagine living in a socialist USA. And, when the people who were the chief editors, Debbie and Michael Smith and Francis Golden, went to the publisher, and, the publisher is not an insignificant publisher. It's HarperCollins, it's huge. In the office suite, because at the bottom level everybody's in a cubicle. The top, there's Louis XIV furniture and a suite and so on. The guy had 2 pillows on his couch. One was a landscape and the other a picture of Karl Marx on a pillow. People are recognizing that there's a necessity for change. If they didn't, this book wouldn't be published and it wouldn't be very successful on Amazon. Because people, Karl Marx, not Groucho. I'm talking about. It's important here. So.
Groucho Marx for president.
Yeah, posthumous presidency. At least it's not much different from what we have now. But whatever. Anybody else with a question? Yes.
I'm sorry.
Well, you started. Go ahead, and then I'll go 1, 2, 3.
I think we should mention the success of the consciousness-raising sessions here for the feminist movement and how those happened across the nation. Were very, very, very integral to getting the movement going.
They were, because people talked about what was happening in their own life.
Yes.
It wasn't that you have to swallow some ideology. It's that you find what's important by talking about what your life is like. And it was personal. And that's very important, to include the personal. That's certainly what I'm trying to do. Yes? And then we were going this way.
You talk a lot about this movement away from Judeo-Christian values in our culture. And, do you think that there's risk of within that movement that becoming a movement associated with spiritualism in general and movement away from spiritualism and humanity? I think by that, right?
Well, it's a difference. I believe in that there's a spirit that is amazing of people coming together around their beliefs. And I think there should be tolerance of however you want to see it that connects you to people and to making a better future for all of us is a great idea. And if your spirituality takes you to child abuse, whoops, that's the problem, because child abuse is the problem, not spirituality. It's that if any hierarchical institution is going to be with no checks and balances, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or right now a lot of the American government or the authoritarian family, means trouble about connection between people. And that's what we can't have. Yes?
No, I was just pointing to him when...
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Very good. All right, I think we've done it. So thank you very much.
So thanks for coming, everybody, and check with the economics website and/or the Student of Economic Interest, because both events last night and today were filmed. We'll have it available. I've already been getting a lot of requests for that, so we'll make that available as soon as possible. Thanks again.